In Bible translations, our next language that we come to is the Ethiopic Bible, the Ethiopic translation. As usual, legends abound as to the origin of Christianity here, and something else is interesting about Ethiopia itself. Not only do the legends abound as to the origin of Christianity here, but to the origin of the country itself. Exactly where that country has been located in different times of history is also a matter that's under dispute. We have an Ethiopia today that's in the news on a fairly regular basis. We have an Ethiopia of past times. We have an Ethiopia in the Old Testament of the King James Version that should generally be rendered Cush, because that would help to differentiate it between what is in modern times thought of as Ethiopia. But just to kind of sum up the question of its location, we will state that it, of course, is south of the country of Egypt. So we're back down into Africa now. We've been to Syria, we've been down into Africa, we've been on several occasions now up into Asia or up into Europe. Now we're back down into Africa with the ancient country of Ethiopia. It's also referred to in ancient history as Abyssinia, 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 Abyssinia. Now there also are some people who dispute the connection of these two terms, of Abyssinia also being an ancient name for Ethiopia, but I think that's probably reliable. Here's a popular tradition among the Ethiopian people that even continues down to today as to the origin of their country. We would have to discuss the origin of their country before discussing the origin of the Bible in their country. And they claim that their country was founded by the grandson of Ham. The grandson of Ham, that's the Ham, not of your refrigerator, but of Noah's descent, Ham, through his son Cush. You have to go back to Genesis 10 in the table of nations there. He's got 3 sons. Ham is one of these, and then Ham has some sons. And according to Ethiopian legend, the grandson of Ham, through Ham's son Cush, therefore a great-grandson, we could say, of Noah, was one Ethiops, spelled just like it sounds, and of course we get our country Ethiopia. Ethiops, Ethiops. Now the country is ancient, there's no doubt about that. I was going to see if my Bible happened to have any maps, and maybe yours would have some maps. I don't think mine would go down that far south. You can check yours and see, but you know where Egypt is. We have to go further south. It may not be the country directly south, because there may be a country that intervenes between the northern tip of Ethiopia and the southern tip of Egypt, but at least it's down in that general region. And that puts it, of course, over on the Red Sea. You've got 2 different gulfs that extend, the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba, that extend one, the former of those to the northwest, the latter of those to the northeast, from the northern tip of the Red Sea, which is truly the Red Sea. The biblical sea may have been the Sea of Reeds. It may have been really a lake, part of the Bitter Lakes, and not the Red Sea, but what is truly considered to be the Red Sea, and to this day is truly considered to be the Red Sea, then that would, of course, be an eastern boundary to the country of Ethiopia or Abyssinia. There's to the origin of their country. It's just legend. We don't really know. It's an ancient country. It's an ancient group of people. They're dark-skinned and they're tall people. We do know that. Concerning their religion, they are supposedly around the time of Solomon, a nation which is converted to the Jewish religion. This again is historical legend, and the percentage of this that's valid is not known. They tell us that the religion of Israel was brought to them through the son born from the union of King Solomon and a certain queen. I wonder what her name might be. The Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba. And here's where we really enter dispute. We're going to draw the northern coast of Africa. Well, I need to go up to the north a little bit. The northern coast of Africa, I'll put it up this far. And here's Jerusalem, the mouth to the Nile River. And then down here you have the Red Sea, you have the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba. Here's Mount Sinai. It's supposed to be the buffer zone, between Israel and Egypt today. Here's the ancient port, which is a very expensive modern resort of Aqaba in Israel today. The Red Sea, and so forth. And of course all of this is Saudi Arabia today. And then you get down here and you have Yemen and all of these other 20 countries down here. This is Nile River. So that puts Ethiopia. She's going to have ports on the Red Sea. Let's just put Ethiopia down this far. We've got Egypt up here. Where in the world is Sheba? Well, that's one thing that is certainly disputed, and that's one thing that really no one has any definite answers to. So most of that is strictly a legend among the people that the Queen of Sheba, and Sheba is, either a city or a region or maybe a shortened form or maybe an antiquated form of Ethiopia, has something to do with Ethiopia. And so the Queen of Sheba, some type of Ethiopian princess, travels all the way up into Israel and has relations with Solomon and he with her, and then they produce a son whose name was Menelik, Menelik. Now, by the way, there's nothing in the Bible that tells us this. She went and asked him questions. And so it's surely and purely extra-biblical, and I don't know how reliable that would be. It doesn't seem that anything as far as carnal relations took place between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Although you might think you have evidence with all of the carnal relations that did take place between Solomon and so many other women. But be that as it may, a son was born, Menelik by name, who was raised under Solomon in Jerusalem. Whenever he came of age, which would have been toward the end of the 10th century BC, then he took a company of Jewish priests, and they, along with him, stole the Ark of the Covenant and carried it away to Ethiopia. Now we know that's a myth. That's why I'm a little dubious of this whole story. They took it to their temple at their capital of Aksum, A-K-S-U-M, which may have been the modern Aksum of Ethiopia, A-X-U-M as it's spelled today. The story I've just given you is preserved in a recension of a work entitled Glory of Kings, that in extant form dates only back to the 14th century A.D. That's a little bit about their background as far as monotheism. According to local tradition, they are supposedly a monotheistic people and have been that since the 10th century BC, but that's highly suspect. What about the origins of Christianity? Many times we do discuss this with these nations. The origins of Christianity. Well, we have many theories which have been suggested. Do you happen to know one of those? You do if you think. Philip? The fellow in the chariot? Okay, Acts 8. Philip converts this Ethiopian eunuch who's a treasurer under Candace, the queen. Okay, Acts 8, verses 26 through 39. is the passage upon which it is usually assumed that Christianity made its way into Ethiopia. But some of the chief authorities in the study of the origin of Christianity in some of these early nations like Ethiopia, Bruce Metzger, violently disputes this in his book on biblical text and manuscripts. And his argument is that there was no woman ruling Ethiopia at this time. We're talking about the mid-1st century A.D., that a man was ruling Ethiopia. Let's see exactly how Luke has this stated. Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. We do have an interesting passage here relating to this man. I don't think that Luke's reason for including it is to give us a history to the introduction of Christianity into Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is not that significant of a country. Why not give us all the history into eastern Syria, or all the history into France or Spain, or all the history into North Africa, that part which is west of Alexandria, or something like that, regions that are more significant, more important. And he doesn't give just a small section. He gives, a third of a chapter here. So probably he's dealing with other things, Messiahship of Christ, and a whole basket full of topics here, and not just Ethiopia. But, of course, the term does come up. We're in Acts 8 and verse 26. And an angel of the Lord spake unto Philip, saying, Arise and go toward the south, unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. Now, where has he been prior to verse 26? Samaria. Okay, here's Samaria way up here. And here we come down to Gaza. One of those old cities in the Philistine realm. He arose and went, and so he probably comes from Samaria and probably comes over the sea route down to Gaza. He arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia. And we should leave this the same. I generally have had you in the past, in the Old Testament, change Ethiopia to Cush, but in the New Testament, by this time, there is a country going by this name, whereas maybe what is now and was then in the New Testament Ethiopia formerly was the territory referred to as Cush. A man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority, under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. Okay, Luke seems to imply that she's just that, a queen. So the only thing that we could say is, according to Metzger, well, maybe she wasn't in control of the country. Maybe she was the queen married to the king, and the king was the one who was in control of the country, and therefore the king's name would be the name in maybe the preserved extant registers of the past royalty of this country of Ethiopia, and not the name of the queen. But then, of course, we'd have the problem, why does he refer to her as though she was the ruler, not just the wife of the ruler, but the ruler, queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of all her treasure? Seems like it would be the treasure that belonged to whoever controlled the country, the empire of the Ethiopians. And this man had come to Jerusalem for to worship. And we don't know exactly why he's coming to Jerusalem. He was returning and sitting in his chariot, reading Isaiah the prophet. Then the Spirit said to Philip, Go near and join thyself to this chariot. And Philip ran thither to him, and heard him read the prophet Isaiah, and said, Understandest thou what thou readest? And he said, How can I, except some man should guide me? And he desired Philip that he would come up and sit with him. And the place of the scripture which he read was this: He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before his shearer, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. The eunuch answered Philip and said, I pray thee, of whom speaketh the prophet of this? Of himself or of some other man? And, of course, we know Philip opened his mouth and began to preach Jesus from the Scripture. And as they went on their way, they came to a certain water. The eunuch said, See, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? And he commanded the chariot to stand still. And they went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. When they were come up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord called away Philip, that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. Metzger further complains that Candace was the dynastic name of a group of queens who ruled a kingdom further to the south of Ethiopia, but a region which oftentimes was confused with Ethiopia itself. That's basically his line of argument against what we would take as at least an implication, if not more, from what Luke the historian records in Acts chapter 8. Metzger disputes this connection between Acts chapter 8 and the origins of Christianity in Ethiopia by saying that no woman ruled at this time, a king ruled, and furthermore that the name Candace was a dynastic title that was held by a group of queens. It wasn't just one woman's name, and that's okay, we could handle that. But he goes on to say a group of queens that ruled a kingdom further to the south of Ethiopia, but a kingdom that was oftentimes confused with Ethiopia because they were close neighbors. We've also got comments along this line in Eusebius, H.E. 2:1-13, where he makes reference to connections between Acts 8 and the origins of Christianity in Ethiopia. Eusebius, H.E. 2:1-13, and also in Irenaeus against heresies, his famous work, Irenaeus, Irenaeus against heresies 4:22-2. So there's one suggestion. Another suggestion for the origins of Christianity would be what I just call the great variety of apostles. Some authors say Matthew, some say Bartholomew, some say Andrew. Maybe a few even think Judas Iscariot. I don't know. They always have something for one of the apostles, some country that one of the apostles converted to Christianity. Those are the three chief names, if you'll leave off the last one, which was just a joke. Matthew, Bartholomew, and Andrew. Just, for sake of curiosity, early writers, and I guess we ourselves would wonder what happened. What did these apostles do? So either Matthew, Bartholomew, or Andrew, or all three of these together, or a combination of two. But there's no really evidence. There's no real evidence for that. Then a third suggestion: Christianity came toward the end of the 4th century A.D. And this is found in the writings of Rufinus, Rufinus. This is a theory of Rufinus, that Christianity did not come to Ethiopia until the end of the 4th century. And here's how it came. 2 young men from Tyre, from the Phoenician port of Tyre, were, along with their uncle, traveling by boat in the Red Sea. Skipping all the details of why they were down there, the Phoenicians, we do know, were seafarers. They traveled by sea a lot. And they decided to make a port call to stop at an Ethiopian port, which, as I've shown you, would have been on the Red Sea. So there's nothing inherently incorrect or possibly incorrect with this. Whenever they stopped, these 2 young men along with their uncle, whenever they stopped at this port, the native Ethiopians murdered all of the men on board, except these 2 boys. And these 2 boys just happened to be Christians from Tyre. Nothing inherently improbable with that. And furthermore, and finally, these 2 Christian boys were spared, and they were later able to preach the gospel there, which worked its way all the way up to the court of the king or queen, and the country was converted. Now Metzger is totally in favor of this romantic story preserved in Rufinus. And he leans toward a very late date. The 4th century A.D. is rather late. A late date for Christianity penetrating Ethiopia. My opinion, and it seems like most other scholars' opinion, is that this date seems to be too late. 4th century A.D. is too late. Remember, Christianity is in Egypt by the middle of the 1st century A.D., by the year 50, because we know of all the Jews down there. We know how quickly Christianity would have reached this place. We know of Acts chapter 18, that Apollos came from here as well. And if we're going to accept anything, why not just accept what Luke has to say? Metzger's evidence just doesn't seem to be convincing that there were not queens over Ethiopia, and that Candace was not a dynastic name for the Ethiopian queens. He's got evidence, but his evidence to me doesn't seem to be conclusive enough. So those three theories, either Luke's theory, the apostolic theory, or the theory of Rufinus, which Metzger is in total favor and total agreement with, of those three theories, I guess we'd opt for the first one. Acts 8:26 to 39 probably gives us the origins of Christianity. I mean, let's just go back to it. You say, well, how do we know for certain? Well, look at verse 27. Let's just assume that Luke has made mistakes about whether it was a queen or a king, or we could assume, I mean, there are many things we could assume, that he intends for us to understand that he's just speaking of the queen, but really she's married to the ruler of the country, who's the king. And maybe he made a mistake about the name Candace. It really fits with a group of people further to the south of Ethiopia. Well, of course, if you're assuming he made those mistakes, and you're assuming that the scriptures as we have them now are not inerrant, but I guess we would at least assume that the germ of his story is true, that Philip or some Christian met this man from Ethiopia, whether he was a eunuch or whatever, he was some type of man from Ethiopia. If we don't at least believe this, we have nothing reliable in this story. It's just all false fairy tale. This man is converted. Verse 38, he commanded the chariot to stand still. They went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And the end of verse 39, Philip was called away that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. Now, if he's gotten converted under the ministry of the evangelist Philip, we're in the 1st century, the days of the apostles, right in the middle of the 1st century A.D., then are we really to think this man goes back to Ethiopia and does nothing about Christianity, does nothing about evangelism, does nothing about witnessing? I just think that's so suspect I couldn't even follow that. I couldn't believe that. I guess I'm convinced that the odds would be in our favor if this man goes back to Ethiopia and he is the one who introduces Christianity to the people. Now, whether it reaches Candace, the queen, or the king, we're not told that here. You see, we're not talking about what turned Ethiopia into a total Christian state. The records don't seem to say that Ethiopia was ever a totally Christian state. All this business about the Jewish religion, all of that is probably false. Maybe you have a few religious, pious people that initiated that and some that want to maintain that. But that's false. We're not asking for the date for the conversion of the whole country, just for the introduction of Christianity, because if we don't have Christianity, our point is we don't have Bible translations there. We don't have the New Testament translated. We're trying to find out how early was Christianity so that we can then find out how early is the Bible. Okay, let's go into translations of the Bible in Ethiopian then. Now, I think with the last two studies that we've done, last two language groups, there's been an outstanding name like Mesrab or Ophilas. Unlike what we've said with these two language groups, no one significant name stands out as the undisputed or the traditionally likely translator of the Bible or an inventor of the alphabet. Remember, both of these men, Mesrab and Ophilas, have something to do not only with translation, but with the creation or the invention of an alphabet for the people, so that not only can he then translate the Bible, but they can then read it. Here is the evidence that seems to be reliable for the Ethiopian Bible. In the middle of the 4th century A.D., that's why, by the way, if you just put a little footnote, why some people are in favor of the Rufinus theory, that Christianity doesn't come until the end of the 4th century, or the middle, or whatever you want to say, sometime late, in other words, because the Bible in Ethiopia doesn't come back in the 1st century. It's going to come later on in history. And then people ask, why? If Christianity has been there since AD 50, why wait 100, 200, 300, 400 years before we actually have the Bible there? Let's look at this evidence. The middle of the 4th century A.D., King Ezana, E-Z-A-N-A, King Ezana of Aksum, the capital, A-K-S-U-M, was won over to Christianity. And with him a large part of the native people. Now, Christianity did not become state religion here, as we've seen with one of the earlier language groups. But Christianity does have a short-term impact upon the people. Assuming that this is true, translating work must have commenced shortly after this. But it was characterized by A, being very slow, and B, by being very sporadic. They would work a while, stop a while, work a while, stop a while. Middle of the 4th century. We're talking about 350, A.D. 350. King Ezana of Aksum was converted to Christianity and a large number of his people with him. And they begin evidently translating the Bible then. However, it's sporadic. They go a while, they stop a while. A new impetus was given in the 5th century to get on with the work of translation when a certain event takes place. When Syrian monks fled their country because of imperial persecution of the Monophysites, which came about after the Council of Chalcedon in 451 A.D. This was the council that had to do with the Nestorians versus the Monophysites versus the Orthodox, I guess we could say. So we're talking about the middle of the 5th century, 100 years now after the conversion of King Ezana. You see, with the Council of Chalcedon in 451, then the Orthodox position is the only recognized position in Christianity on the persons and natures of Christ, or persons and nature of Christ, I should say. And as a result, many monks in Syria had to flee. Remember, we've talked before about the Jacobites, the Nestorians, Monophysitism in Syria. And of course, the Syrian church was a Nestorian group, a Jacobite group, because that was the Nestorian branch of that. That was the Syrian branch of that, rather. The Syrian monks had to flee their country because of imperial persecution of the Monophysites. And the best place they found to go was go further and further south. If you go north, you're going right into the heart of Christianity. When you get up into Asia Minor and you get up near Constantinople, or you get over into Greece, or you get over into Italy, and you don't want to go towards China or India, there's nothing over there, so the only place to go is south. And they go all the way down through Egypt, crossing through Sinai, through Egypt, down into Ethiopia. This, I'm saying, gave new impetus to continuing the work of translation after the council at Chalcedon in 451. The next major thing we have with regard to their translating work is the explosive rise of Islam in the 6th century. This gave also an impetus, but it was rather negative. It slowed the work of Ethiopian translations because they were being bombarded so much by the tenets and by the messengers of Islam. See, part of the Syrian church to this day is a Monophysite church. Syrian church is an Eastern church, and part of it to this day believes in the one aspect of Christ's person and not in a dual aspect, as Paul seems to teach in Romans chapter 1. So part of the Syrian church to this day is Monophysite. And all of the Ethiopian church, as well as all of the Coptic church, I think we've said before, we study the Coptic, is a Monophysite group of people. So all of the the Egyptian Christians, the Coptics, the native Egyptian Christians, and they go by the term Copts, they're Coptic people, as well as the Ethiopian people. All of the native Ethiopian and Coptic church, all of this is a monophysite church to this day. And maybe this explains, I'm getting a little ahead of the story, but maybe this explains the Syriac influence seen in the Ethiopian Bible. Why? Because the Syrian monks are the ones fleeing their country and they're going down into Ethiopia. They were monks, therefore they were religiously minded people. They were trained probably in translation work. All they have to do is pick up with where they had left off in Syria and, of course, switch languages and continue their religious work and religious studies down in Ethiopia. The Old Testament came from the Greek. Therefore, it's a secondary translation, probably from the LXX. But it was later revised in light of Hebrew manuscripts, which the Ethiopian translators obtained. The New Testament probably came from the Syriac, although some people have said it could be the Greek. Somewhere between the 4th to the 7th centuries. New Testament was rescinded once in the early centuries here in Ethiopia, and again in later centuries in a literary revival under the influence of Arabic Bibles from Alexandria. And that later date for the second recension of the Ethiopian New Testament is disputed. Robertson gives the date the 12th century A.D. And I favor Greenlee's position of the 14th century A.D. That's the second and the last great recension of the Ethiopian New Testament. Okay, let's look at what we just said. The Old Testament secondary because it came not from Hebrew but from Greek. The New Testament is secondary because it came not from Greek but from Syriac. Obviously, the consequence of that is it's not a very reliable Bible. It's not a version, secondary translation, not a version in the technical sense, which is a primary translation, but it's a secondary translation. Which means, of course, that you have one language intervening between the original and the receptor language. I don't think I'll go into this little history of Islam and Mohammedism again, but we've already studied a little bit of that before, and that's what wipes out so much of the influence and so much of the good that is taking place in Christianity in Ethiopia, because it was a phenomenon almost without parallel. Maybe the only parallel would be the spread of Christianity, and of course Christianity has spread to a greater degree because it's spread to more parts of the world. It has a stronger hold on the world than does the religion of Islam. But be that as it may, Islam is a very strong, very powerful, very significant one of the great religions of the world. So for a date on the Ethiopian Bible, we would say it was probably all complete by the 6th century, with recensions coming later, all the way up to the 14th century, according to Greenlee. Some of you have a few of Greenlee's books. He writes on New Testament textual criticism and New Testament introduction. I think he was a professor at Oral Roberts University. I'm not for sure where he is right now, or maybe he's still there. We're giving you dates on all of these. Ethiopian Bible, probably the 6th century. 500s A.D. Okay, from manuscripts. Manuscripts of the Ethiopian Bible. About 300 manuscripts are extant. That's not a very large number. About 300 of these exist, but most of them, capital M-O-S-T, are from the 16th to the 19th centuries A.D. Incredibly, incredibly late. 19th century, that means it could be less than 100 years old. But 2,000 years almost removed from the New Testament. About 300 manuscripts, and the vast majority of those date from the 16th to the 19th century. There are none earlier. Ethiopian Bible probably done in the 6th century AD, 500s. There are none earlier than the 13th century AD, which makes it almost without meaningful use, the Ethiopian Bible in textual studies today. Okay, here are just a few examples. The oldest Ethiopian manuscript of biblical importance is a copy of the four Gospels that dates from the 13th century, none earlier than the 13th century, and it's housed in Paris. The oldest known of Acts and the Epistles is a 14th century manuscript in Milan. And this 14th century of Acts and the Epistles is a polyglot. What's a polyglot? What's a bilingual? What's a polyglot? Many languages. Ethiopian, Syriac, Coptic of the Bohairic family, Arabic, and Armenian. Quite a Bible. Acts and the Epistles, a polyglot. It's got all these languages: Ethiopian, Syriac, Bohairic, Coptic, Arabic, and Armenian. Book of Revelation, we do have several, but none earlier than the 15th century. We do have some from the 15th century. And I think I'll pass around another one of Worthwain's famous plates in the back of his book. This is part of Job and Daniel, from a manuscript that contains Job and Daniel. I don't see a... I see. It was probably written maybe 13th century here. This is a rather old one then. I don't see much important things to say about it, but here's what the Ethiopian Bible would look like. Worthwain has so many famous plates in the back of his book, it's almost wise to buy his book for no other reason. You got all these plates, all these examples of Vulgates, of old Hebrew Bibles, old Greek Bibles, the caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the jars in which the scrolls were found, and just Arabic Bibles, Armenian Bibles, old church Slavonic Bibles, just a little bit of everything. And by the way, speaking of books, I meant to say that before I got started tonight. I think we'll probably send off an order. I've got enough people wanting various books. I haven't checked the list recently, but I think there are some over there. Probably send off an order maybe tomorrow. So if some of you wanted that A.N. Sherwin-White's book on Roman society and Roman law in the New Testament and have not paid, some of you have paid. If you have not, then be sure to pay me if you want yours to go out in this order. Okay, the first printed edition of the Ethiopic New Testament was done in Rome in 2 volumes in the years 1548 and 1549. You'll see why this is important here in a moment. First printed edition of the New Testament was done in Rome in 2 volumes in 1548 and 1549. For its textual affinities, it leans toward Byzantine text type. It almost have to, coming so late in history. The Ethiopian Bible, moreover, contains the Apocrypha, all of it. They accept the Apocrypha as canonical, and some of the pseudepigrapha. Among others, here are some of the chief pseudepigraphal works that the Ethiopian Bible accepts. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, Baruch and the Apocalypse of Esdras. Enoch, Book of Jubilees, Ascension of Isaiah, Baruch, and the Apocalypse of Esdras. Okay, that leaves us with some abbreviations. We really only have one that's of major importance, but UBS and the Greek Bibles will give more than one, and CAs and Learned Works will give more than one, so you might as well be familiar with those. EAPCR, that means the Ethiopian Bible does represent all of the aspects of the New Testament. They do not leave out the book of Revelation. ETH, obviously, for Ethiopian, the 6th century. And then what we do next, and what you'll generally find next, is something that has to do with this first printed edition. EAPCR, ETHRO. That means that if they're quoting or alluding or making some reference back to the Ethiopian Bible, they're not going back to some specific Ethiopic or Ethiopian manuscript, but back to the first printed edition of the Ethiopian New Testament, which was done at Rome in 1548 and 1549. So it's 16th century because it comes right in the middle of the 1500s. EAPCR has all of the New Testament, abbreviated ETH superscript RO. Then you have another, gets a little more complicated, EAPCR ETH superscript PP. Superscript PP. Recent times, the 19th century. I'll have to explain what that PP means if you want to write some of this down. If you see this reference, by the way, most of the time what you'll just see is ETH if you're looking in your CA. You will see these more rarely than you'll see that first one, just ETH means Ethiopic, some Ethiopian or Ethiopic manuscript. If you see ETHPP, here's what it means. It's speaking of a published Ethiopian New Testament in 1826 for the Gospels, and 1830 for the rest of the New Testament, by the BFBS, British and Foreign Bible Society, BFBS. A published Ethiopian New Testament in 2 phases. 1826, the Gospels. 1830, you'd have your A through R, APCR, Acts, Pauline, Catholic, Revelation, done by BFBS, British, Foreign, and Bible Society. Prepared by Thomas Pell Platt. Thomas Pell, P-E-L-L, Platt, P-L-A-T-T. Formerly a fellow at Trinity College. And that's not all. We don't get our PP from his last name and his middle name. We get our first P from his last name, Platt. That's what the first P stands for, if you want to make a notation of that. The first P stands for the last name of Thomas Pell Platt. He's the one who prepared this British and Foreign Bible Society published edition of the Ethiopian New Testament. Then in 1899, it was revised by Franz Pretorius. Franz Pretorius. P-R-A-E-T-O-R-I-U-S. So Platt is the first P, Pretorius is the second P. So we've got 2 phases thus far of the 2-phased published Ethiopian New Testament. First, the one that was done over 5 years, from 1826 to 1830, by Thomas Pell Platt. Then it's revised by Franz Pretorius in 1899. And then finally, in 1968, it was reissued by the American Bible Society, the PP, Platt Pretorius edition of the Ethiopian New Testament. And then this is something that's even more rare. All this manuscript contains would be E, the Gospels. It's abbreviated ETH superscript MS, which is just abbreviation for manuscript. And it dates probably from the 13th to the 14th century. And it's one manuscript at Paris that is referred to, sometimes I've seen it referred to both of these ways, either as manuscript number 32, and it would look like this, capital MS, number 32, or the same, for some reason, number 22, just two different classifications. The best way to know it as far as your critical apparatus is concerned is that it is ETHMS. That means one particular manuscript. That's a fairly important manuscript, obviously, because look how early it is. It goes back to as early of a date as what we have for extant Ethiopian manuscripts, and that would be the 1200s AD, the 13th century.